What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to share a story that came from a 911 dispatcher with 6 years on the job. Someone who's taken thousands of emergency calls ranging from medical emergencies to violent crimes. Most emergency calls are loud. People screaming, crying, yelling for help, panic-making voices rise to maximum volume. But the calls that haunt dispatchers most aren't the loud ones, they're the whispers. The calls where someone is hiding, where danger is so close that speaking at normal volume means discovery, means violence, means death. This dispatcher received a call that lasted exactly 4 minutes and 32 seconds. A woman whispering that someone was in her house, that he was walking around searching for her, that she was hiding and needed help desperately, but couldn't speak loud enough to be heard by the intruder just meters away. Those 4.5 minutes changed everything for this dispatcher, changed how he listened to calls, changed how he slept at night, changed his understanding of how much can happen in just a few minutes when you're listening to someone. Hide from a predator while help races to arrive before it's too late. If you're enjoying this content, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Let's get into the story. Most emergency calls you take as a 911 dispatcher follow certain patterns after you've been doing the job long enough. Medical emergencies where people are panicked but providing information between gasps and tears. Traffic accidents where shock makes people speak too fast or too slow. Domestic disturbances where you can hear shouting and breaking objects in the background. Robberies and assaults where victims are either hysterical or strangely calm, depending on whether the immediate danger has passed. After 6 years working dispatch for a mid-sized city, I thought I'd heard every type of emergency call possible. Thought I understood the full spectrum of human crisis as expressed through phone calls. Thought I'd developed the emotional distance necessary to do the job without being destroyed by the constant exposure to other people's worst moments. The calls that are hardest to handle aren't necessarily the ones with the worst outcomes, aren't always the ones where people die or suffer catastrophic injuries. Sometimes the most difficult calls are the ones where you can hear the terror in someone's voice, where you understand viscerally that they're in immediate danger, where every second counts and you're acutely aware that the help you're sending might not arrive in time. Those calls create a specific kind of stress. A helplessness that comes from being the voice of hope for someone who's trapped, who's desperate, who's putting their survival in your hands even though all you can do is coordinate response and try to keep them calm while units race to their location through traffic and distance that suddenly feels infinite. Whispered calls are a special category of terror, both for the caller and for the dispatcher receiving them. Whispered calls mean someone is hiding, mean the threat is close enough that normal speech volume would reveal their location, mean they're in such immediate danger that even the act of calling for help is risking their life. And as a dispatcher, you understand that dynamic, understand that every word they speak could be the word that gets them discovered, that gets them hurt, that ends their life, so you have to balance getting information with keeping them as quiet as possible. Have to ask essential questions, while being conscious that each question requires an answer that could be heard by whoever they're hiding from. I've taken maybe 20 whispered calls over my 6 years. Situations where people called from closets hiding from home invaders, from bathrooms hiding from domestic abusers, from cars hiding from pursuers, from offices hiding from active shooters. Each one creating that same cold dread in my stomach, that same desperate urgency to get help there as fast as possible. That same awful awareness that I'm listening to someone whose next few minutes will determine whether they live or die. Most whispered calls end okay. Help arrives before the person is discovered, or the threat leaves before finding them, or somehow they manage to escape. But the anxiety of those minutes while you're listening, while you're dispatching, while you're hoping units can get there in time, that never gets easier, never becomes routine, never stops feeling like you're personally responsible for whether this person survives. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning. Technically morning, though it felt like deepest night. At 2:47 a.m. when the city was at its quietest. when most calls were drunk drivers or late-night domestics or medical emergencies from elderly, people who'd fallen and couldn't get up. I was on my second cup of coffee, trying to stay alert through the dead hours, working solo because overnight shifts were minimally staffed. Just me and 2 other dispatchers handling the entire city, and my board had been quiet for almost an hour, no active calls. Just monitoring radio traffic from units on patrol, the calm before whatever crisis the rest of the night would bring. The call came in, cellular call, number I didn't recognize, and I clicked to accept it. Gave my standard greeting, 911, what's your emergency? Expecting the usual responses, expecting panic or confusion or medical symptoms, but instead I heard something that made every muscle in my body tense immediately, a whisper, so quiet I almost couldn't make out the words. Female voice, young, absolutely terrified. Please, someone is in my house. He's walking around downstairs. I can hear him. Please. Send help? The volume was so low that I had to press my headset tight against my ear, had to strain to distinguish words from background silence. And even as I was processing what she'd said, I was already starting to type, already pulling up her location from the cellular coordinates, already preparing to dispatch units. Ma'am, I'm sending help right now. Can you tell me your exact address? I kept my voice low too, instinctively matching her volume. Some training document had said that helps keep callers calm, helps them feel you're with them, but also I felt like speaking too loud would somehow make her more vulnerable, would somehow be heard by whoever was in her house, even though logically I knew that was impossible. She whispered the address, 2834 Ashford Lane, upstairs. I'm hiding in the bedroom closet. He's downstairs, but I can hear him moving around. Oh God, please hurry. I typed the address, confirmed it matched the cellular location, dispatched 2 units with high priority. Home invasion in progress, victim hiding, perpetrator still on scene, unknown if armed. Estimated response time 8 minutes based on current unit locations. 8 minutes doesn't sound like much when you say it. Less time than it takes to watch a YouTube video. Less time than a typical coffee break. But when you're hiding in a closet listening to an intruder search your house, when you're whispering to a 911 dispatcher begging for help, when every second feels like an hour because adrenaline makes time distort, 8 minutes is an eternity, is the difference between life and death, is more time than some people have before they're discovered, before violence happens, before survival becomes a question rather than a certainty. I knew 8 minutes was too long, knew from her voice that she might not have 8 minutes, and I started trying to get additional units diverted, trying to find anyone closer, trying to shave even 30 seconds off that response time. Help is on the way. They'll be there as fast as possible. I need you to stay on the line with me. I need you to tell me what's happening. Can you see anything from where you're hiding? I was trying to gather information while also keeping her connected, keeping her anchored to the lifeline of my voice, keeping her from panicking and making noise that would reveal her location. She whispered back, breathing ragged, I can't see anything. I'm in the closet. Door is closed. It's completely dark, but I can hear him. He's moving things, opening doors, cabinets maybe, looking for something, or looking for me. I don't know. I don't know who he is. I don't know what he wants. I just woke up and heard noises and grabbed my phone and hid. The terror in her voice was palpable, genuine life or death fear. And I felt my own heart rate elevating, felt the adrenaline that comes with high-stakes calls, felt the weight of being her only connection to help. I asked her name, trying to establish personal connection, trying to make her feel less alone, and she whispered, Sarah Mitchell. I'm 28. I live alone. I don't know who this is. I don't know why someone is in my house. The fact that she lived alone made this worse, meant there was no one else there to help, no roommate or partner who might intervene. Just Sarah hiding and an intruder with unknown intentions having free access to her home. I asked if she had any idea how the person got in, whether doors or windows had been locked, whether alarm had been set, trying to assess how prepared the intruder was, whether this was opportunistic or planned, whether he was looking for valuables or looking for her specifically, all details that would help responding officers understand what they were walking into. All my doors were locked. I checked before bed. I always check. Windows were closed because it's October and cold at night. I don't understand how he got in. I didn't hear anything until I woke up and heard footsteps downstairs. Heard cabinet doors, heard him moving around like he was searching for something. Her breathing was getting faster, panic building despite her efforts to stay quiet, and I could hear the edge in her voice, the barely controlled terror of someone whose safe space had been violated, whose home had become a trap with her hiding inside it while predator hunted. I tried to keep my own voice steady, tried to project calm I didn't feel, tried to be the anchor she needed. Sarah, you're doing great. You did exactly the right thing by calling, by hiding, by staying quiet. Help is coming. Officers are 6 minutes away. I'm going to stay on the line with you the whole time. 6 minutes now. 2 minutes had passed while we talked. While one gathered information, while units raced through empty pre-dawn streets with lights and sirens, while Sarah crouched in darkness listening to intruder below, 6 minutes still felt impossibly long, still felt like time enough for everything to go wrong, and I was acutely aware that the situation could change in seconds, that intruder could come upstairs, could find her, could turn this from a frightening ordeal into a violent assault or worse. I monitored the radio with one ear while talking to Sarah, heard units updating their locations, heard them getting closer, heard the urgency in their voices as they acknowledged the high priority call, heard them coordinating approach to minimize warning to the perpetrator. He's getting louder, Sarah whispered suddenly, voice tight with fresh fear. He's not trying to be quiet anymore. He's slamming things, cursing. I think he's angry. I think he's frustrated he's not finding whatever he's looking for. Oh God, what if he comes upstairs? What if he finds me? The escalation in the intruder's behavior was concerning, suggested growing frustration, suggested someone who might become more aggressive, more violent, more dangerous as his search continued without results, and I felt urgency spike, felt the need to get units there faster somehow. Felt helpless sitting at my desk listening while Sarah faced threat I could only imagine. I told her to stay as still as possible, to control her breathing, to not make any sound no matter what she heard. Told her that police were almost there, 4 minutes now, just 4 more minutes and she'd be safe. I heard it through the phone clearly, the sound that changed everything. Heavy footsteps on stairs, deliberate, ascending, and Sarah's breathing stopped completely. I could tell she was holding her breath, frozen in terror as the intruder came to the second floor where she was hiding. He's coming upstairs, she breathed, whisper so faint I almost didn't catch it. Oh God, he's coming up here. He's in the hallway. I can hear him right outside the bedroom. Please, please, please tell me they're almost here. I confirmed units were 3 minutes away. 3 minutes, 180 seconds, time that now felt cosmic in scale. Infinite, insurmountable, and I was silently begging the officers to drive faster, to somehow compress time and distance, to arrive before the worst happened. The bedroom door opened. I heard it through the phone, heard the creak of hinges, heard footsteps entering the room, heavy boots on hardwood floor, and Sarah's breathing was so shallow I could barely detect it. She was in the closet listening to someone enter her bedroom, listening to him move around, and I could hear him too through her phone. Could hear drawers being opened, could hear hangers being pushed aside in what must have been a different closet, could hear systematic search of someone looking thoroughly, someone determined to find whatever he was looking for. And I realized with horror that what he was looking for was probably her. This wasn't a burglary. This was a hunt, and Sarah was the prey. Stay absolutely still, I whispered into my mic, knowing she could hear me even if she couldn't respond. Don't move. Don't make any sound. Help is almost there. 2 minutes. 2 minutes, 120 seconds, time I could count in heartbeats and breaths. In the escalating sounds of searching that were getting closer to Sarah's hiding place, and I heard him, heard the intruder speak for the first time. Voice muffled but audible through the phone, male voice, angry voice, saying something I couldn't quite make out, but that sounded like a name, like he was calling someone's name, like he was calling for Sarah, and that confirmed my worst fear. This wasn't random. He knew who lived here. He'd come specifically for her, and he was determined to find her. The closet door, Sarah's closet door, I heard it. Heard the distinctive sound of a sliding closet door being opened. Heard Sarah gasp. Heard her voice rise from whisper to actual speech for the first time. No, please don't. Heard the terror unleashed as hiding place was compromised. As predator found prey, as the moment every person hiding in fear dreads became reality. I was shouting into my radio now, abandoning dispatcher composure. Units expedite. Victim is being discovered. Suspect is with victim now. Expedite, goddammit. Heard acknowledgments from units. Heard sirens in the background of the radio traffic, meaning they were close. But close wasn't there. Close wasn't in time. Close was still too far. The sounds that came through the phone for the next minute and a half were the worst sounds I'd ever heard in 6 years of dispatch. Were sounds I still hear in nightmares. Were sounds of violence, of struggle, of Sarah screaming, fighting, being hurt, of a male voice shouting, of impacts, of crashing, of pure chaos and terror, and the phone was on the ground somewhere, had been dropped, but the connection stayed open. And I was forced to listen, to bear witness, to know that I was hearing. Someone being attacked, and there was nothing I could do, no words I could say, no comfort I could offer, just helpless listening while violence happened and help raced to arrive too late to prevent it. The attack lasted for what my call log later showed was 93 seconds. 1 minute and 33 seconds of sounds that I will never forget, that I've replayed in therapy trying to process, that I've listened to in the recorded call file during investigation trying to identify. Details that might help prosecute the perpetrator. 93 seconds doesn't sound like much. Barely longer than a commercial break, but when you're listening to someone being hurt, when every second contains sounds of violence, when you're helpless to do anything except listen and hope, those seconds stretch into subjective eternity, become the longest minute and a half of your life, become trauma that doesn't fade with time. I could hear Sarah fighting back, could hear her screaming at him to stop, to leave, could hear impacts that I knew were punches or kicks or her being thrown against furniture, could hear the male voice, which was clearer now, shouting things like "thought you could hide from me," and "thought you could just leave," and "you're mine. You don't get to decide." Words that revealed a possessiveness, a sense of ownership, suggesting this wasn't a stranger, but someone she knew, someone she'd tried to get away from, someone who'd come to punish her for leaving, for having the audacity to think she could escape him. The psychology of abusers, the mindset of men who see women as property, was on full display in his words. And even while focused on the immediate crisis, I was cataloging details for the investigation, for the charges, for justice that would come if we could just get there in time. Then I heard the sirens, heard them through Sarah's phone, faint but definitely there, getting louder, police arriving. And I heard the intruder hear them too, heard him curse, heard sudden change in sounds, heard running, heard retreat, heard him fleeing rather than facing police, and I heard Sarah crying, hurt but alive, conscious, able to make sound, which meant she was breathing, which meant she'd survived, and I felt overwhelming relief, felt the tension that had been crushing my chest for. 4 minutes and 32 seconds finally release. Felt tears on my face that I hadn't realized were falling. Felt the emotional crash that comes after high adrenaline crisis when you realize the worst outcome has been narrowly avoided. Sarah, can you hear me? Sarah, police are there. You're safe now. Can you speak to me? I was calling to her through the phone that was still connected somewhere on her bedroom floor, hoping she could hear me, hoping she could respond, needing confirmation that she was okay or at least alive. I heard movement, heard the phone being picked up, heard Sarah's voice, broken, pained, crying, but speaking. He's gone. He ran. Police are here. I'm hurt. I'm bleeding. But I'm alive. Oh God, I'm alive. Her words dissolved into sobs, shock and relief and trauma all hitting at once. And I stayed on the line talking to her while officers entered the house, while they cleared rooms, while they found Sarah in her bedroom, while paramedics arrived to treat her injuries, while the scene transitioned from active emergency to crime scene investigation and victim care. The officers took over communication at that point. One of them picking up Sarah's phone, Officer Jenkins, I knew him from previous calls. Good cop, compassionate, and he said, "Dispatch, we have victim secured. She's injured but stable. Multiple contusions and lacerations. Possible broken ribs. Paramedics are treating now. Suspect fled on foot out the back door. We have description, white male. Approximately 6 feet, dark clothing, medium build, ran toward the neighborhood behind the house. We're setting up perimeter now, requesting K-9 unit and air support." I acknowledged and started coordinating additional resources, dispatching K-9, requesting helicopter, alerting neighboring jurisdictions. But my primary focus had shifted. The immediate crisis was over. Sarah was safe. Now it was about catching the perpetrator before he disappeared or hurt someone else. I was eventually relieved by my supervisor who'd come in when he heard the call traffic, who told me to take a break, to decompress, to process what had just happened before taking any new calls. But I couldn't leave, couldn't step away. Needed to know Sarah was okay, needed to know the suspect had been caught. Needed to see this through to some kind of resolution before I could allow myself to feel anything. I monitored the manhunt through radio traffic, heard unit searching, heard K-9 tracking, heard helicopter overhead with infrared scanning backyards and streets, heard the tightening net, and then 45 minutes after the initial call, heard the announcement I'd been waiting for. Suspect in custody, apprehended 3 blocks from scene, positive ID from victim via photo. He's being transported to station now. They caught him, Derek Thompson, 29 years old, Sarah's ex-boyfriend. 2-year relationship that had ended 3 months earlier when Sarah finally recognized the warning signs of escalating control and emotional abuse. Had gotten a restraining order, had blocked his number, had taken all the steps victims are told to take. And none of it had stopped him, none of it had kept him from breaking into her house, from hunting her, from attacking her when he found her. The restraining order was just paper, couldn't physically stop him. Couldn't prevent his obsession, couldn't protect Sarah when he decided the order didn't matter, when he decided his rage and sense of entitlement were more important than law or her safety or basic human decency. The investigation revealed how he'd gotten in. He had a key that Sarah hadn't known about, a copy he'd made during their relationship and never returned, or that she'd never known existed. He'd kept it for 3 months waiting for the right moment. Waiting until restraining order had been in effect long enough that Sarah might have let her guard down slightly, might have started to feel safe again, and then he'd used it in the early morning hours when he knew she'd be asleep, vulnerable, alone. He'd been watching her, tracking her schedule, knowing when she worked, when she was home, when she slept, surveillance that restraining order couldn't prevent. Stalking that was illegal but hard to prove until he actually broke in, until he actually attacked, until it was almost too late. In the interview room, Derek was unrepentant, showed no remorse, actually seemed angry that he'd been caught, that his plan had been interrupted. He'd intended to kill Sarah, admitted it freely, said she deserved it for leaving him, for embarrassing him, for making him look weak by getting the restraining order. The twisted logic of abusers on full display, the inability to accept that she was a person with agency rather than a possession he owned, the rage at being denied control translated into homicidal intent. The detectives got a full confession, got him admitting to planning the break-in, admitting to intending to kill her, admitting he'd been tracking her for months, admitting he'd made the key copy specifically for this purpose, giving prosecutors everything they needed for a strong case, for charges that would put him away for years, for justice that Sarah deserved. I visited Sarah in the hospital the next day. Not standard protocol for dispatchers. We're supposed to maintain professional distance. not get personally involved with callers, but I couldn't help it. Couldn't just move on to the next call without seeing that she was okay. Without closing the loop on the experience we'd shared during those 4 minutes and 32 seconds. Her room was on the 3rd floor, private room. Flowers already arriving from friends and family who'd heard what happened. And when I knocked on her partially open door, she looked up from the bed. Face bruised, left arm in a sling, bandages visible on her neck and forearms. But alive, sitting up, alert, fundamentally okay despite the visible trauma. "You're the dispatcher," she said immediately, recognizing my voice even though we'd never met. Even though she'd only heard me through a phone during the worst moments of her life. "You stayed with me. You kept me calm. You saved my life." I started to protest, to say that officers saved her, that I just did my job. But she cut me off. "No, you kept me from panicking, kept me quiet when I needed to be quiet, kept me connected when I was alone and terrified. If I'd panicked, if I'd made noise, he would have found me sooner, would have had more time before police arrived. You absolutely saved my life, and I needed to say thank you. Needed you to know that what you did mattered." Her words hit me hard, made the emotional weight I'd been carrying since the call feel suddenly lighter, made the trauma of listening feel purposeful, meaningful, worth the cost. We talked for over an hour, Sarah telling me about her relationship with Derek, about how it had started normal, romantic even, about how the control had crept in gradually, small criticisms, small demands, small isolations from friends and family, about how by the time she recognized it as abuse, she was already trapped in patterns that were hard to break, already conditioned to his reactions, already afraid of what would happen if she left. The decision to leave had taken months of planning, of building support systems, of consulting with domestic violence advocates, of understanding that leaving was the most dangerous time, that abusers often escalate to lethal violence when they lose control. And despite all that preparation, despite the restraining order, despite changing locks and being vigilant, he'd still almost succeeded in killing her. "The thing that haunts me," Sarah said quietly, "is that I did everything right. I recognized the abuse. I made a safety plan. I left when he wasn't home. I got legal protection. I blocked his number. I told my friends and family to watch for him. I installed a security system. I changed my routines. I did everything the experts tell you to do, and it still almost wasn't enough. He still got in, still found me, still almost killed me. And that makes me wonder how many other women are doing everything right, and it's still not enough. How many don't survive because their abuser is more determined, more violent, more willing to cross lines than Derek was." The helplessness in her voice reflected a truth about domestic violence that the system doesn't want to acknowledge, that sometimes there is no perfect solution, no guaranteed safety, that determined abusers can breach almost any protection if they're willing to accept the consequences. I told her about the manhunt, about Derek's arrest, about his confession, about the charges he was facing, and I could see relief mixed with anger in her expression, relief that he'd been caught, that he couldn't come after her again while in custody, anger that it had come to this, that the system had failed to stop him before he attacked, that the restraining order that was supposed to protect her had been meaningless. "I want to testify," she said firmly. "I want to look him in the eye in court and tell everyone what he did, what he planned to do. I want him to know that he didn't win, that I survived, that I'm not afraid of him anymore. Or maybe I am still afraid, but I'm more angry than afraid. And that anger is going to fuel me through whatever comes next, through the trial, through the recovery, through rebuilding my life without looking over my shoulder constantly." The detective assigned to Sarah's case, Detective Martinez, arrived while I was still visiting, came to update Sarah on the investigation and take additional statement if she felt up to it. Martinez was experienced with domestic violence cases, had worked dozens of them, and she had a directness tempered with compassion that seemed to put Sarah at ease. "We searched Derek's apartment," Martinez explained, "found disturbing evidence of premeditation, found journals where he'd written about his plans. About watching your house? about his conviction that you deserved to die for leaving him. Found maps of your neighborhood with entry and exit routes marked. Found the key he'd used to enter your house. Everything we need to prove this wasn't impulsive, wasn't heat of passion, was calculated, planned, attempted murder. The evidence was overwhelming, Martinez said. Derek would almost certainly plead guilty or be found guilty at trial. Was facing 20 to 30 years in prison for attempted murder, home invasion, aggravated assault, stalking, violating a restraining order, multiple charges that would run consecutively rather than concurrently, ensuring he'd spend most of his remaining adult life incarcerated. But I need to be honest with you, Martinez continued, voice gentle but firm. Even with his strong case, even with his confession, the trial will be difficult for you. The defense will try to paint your relationship as mutually toxic. Will try to suggest you provoked him somehow. Will try to introduce doubt about who was really the aggressor. It's a standard abuse defense strategy, and it's disgusting, but you need to be prepared for it. Need to know that testifying means reliving the trauma publicly while someone tries to twist it into something it wasn't. Sarah's jaw set with determination. I'm ready for that. I've been preparing for that. I've been working with a victim advocate. I know what to expect, and I'm not going to let him or his liar rewrite history. I'm not going to let them make me the villain in a story where I was the victim. I'm going to tell the truth and trust that the jury sees through the manipulation. I admired her strength, admired her willingness to face further trauma in service of justice. Admired her refusal to be silenced by fear or shame or the knowledge that testifying would be painful. Martinez smiled. That's exactly what I needed to hear. You're going to be a strong witness. And with your testimony combined with the physical evidence and Derek's own statements, we're going to put him away for a very long time. I left the hospital feeling a strange mixture of emotions. Relief that Sarah was okay, pride that I'd played a role in her survival, anger at Derek and at the system that hadn't protected her better, sadness that this was such a common story, that every day dispatchers were taking calls from women hiding from abusive partners, that every day some of those women didn't survive because help arrived too late or because the abuser was more lethal than Derek had been. The statistics were horrifying if you thought about them too much. Domestic violence was one of the leading causes of injury and death for women. Restraining orders were violated in the majority of cases. Many victims were killed by partners or ex-partners despite having active protection orders. The system was fundamentally inadequate to the scale and nature of the problem. Back at the dispatch center, I was treated as a hero by my colleagues, people congratulating me on keeping Sarah calm, on coordinating the response effectively, on handling a high-stress call with professionalism. But I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like someone who'd gotten lucky, who'd happened to get Sarah's call when she was able to hide successfully until help arrived, who'd been spared the alternative outcome where I listened to her being killed, where my voice wasn't enough to keep her calm or quiet, where Derek found her before officers arrived. The difference between the outcome we got and that nightmare alternative was measured in minutes. In the particular layout of Sarah's house that gave officers faster access, in Derek's decision to flee rather than stay and fight, in random chance as much as anything I'd done right, my supervisor pulled me aside at the end of my shift, asked how I was doing, whether I needed to talk to someone, whether I wanted time off to process. I assured him I was fine, just wanted to get back to normal routine, didn't want special treatment, but he looked skeptical. Davis, that was a traumatic call. 4.5 minutes of listening to someone being attacked is not normal routine. It's not something you just shake off. The department has counseling available. I strongly recommend you take advantage of it. There's no shame in getting support after something like this. I agreed to make an appointment with the counselor, more to satisfy him than because I thought I needed it. But over the following days I realized he was right. I was having trouble sleeping, was replaying the call obsessively, was experiencing anxiety when taking new calls wondering if they'd be similar, was showing signs of secondary trauma that required professional help to process. The counselor I saw was Dr. Ellen Chang, a psychologist who specialized in first responder trauma, who understood the unique stresses of emergency services work, who'd worked with dozens of dispatchers dealing with aftermath of difficult calls. She helped me understand that what I was experiencing was normal, that bearing witness to violence even remotely creates trauma, that the helplessness of listening while being unable to directly intervene is particularly difficult for people in helping professions who are trained to solve problems and protect others. Your role as a dispatcher is to be the bridge between crisis and help, she explained. But that means you're simultaneously connected to both the crisis and the knowledge that help is minutes away. You're holding that tension, that gap, and when the gap feels too wide, when help feels like it might not arrive in time, that creates enormous stress that your mind and body have to process. Through our sessions, I began to see Sarah's call not as an isolated incident, but as representative of a broader pattern in my work. I'd been accumulating trauma for 6 years, taking difficult calls, hearing terrible things, bearing witness to human suffering and violence. And I'd been doing what most dispatchers do, compartmentalizing, pushing it down, moving on to the next call without processing. Telling myself I was fine because the job required being fine, because showing emotion was seen as weakness, because the culture of emergency services values toughness over vulnerability. But that approach doesn't eliminate trauma, it just buries it, and eventually buried trauma resurfaces, usually triggered by a call that's particularly disturbing or that resonates with previous calls. That breaks through the emotional walls you've built and forces you to confront everything you've been avoiding. Dr. Chang taught me healthier coping strategies, ways to process calls after they end rather than just suppressing my reactions. Ways to recognize when I was carrying too much and needed to take a break. Ways to maintain appropriate emotional boundaries while still being present and empathetic with callers. You can care without carrying, she said, phrase that stuck with me. You can be present for people in crisis without taking their trauma into yourself, without making their emergency your emergency. It's a balance that takes practice, but it's essential for long-term sustainability in this work. I practiced these techniques over the following weeks. Noticed improvement in my sleep, in my anxiety levels, in my ability to take new calls without being haunted by previous ones. Sarah and I stayed in contact. She'd text occasionally with updates on her recovery, on the legal process, on her emotional state, and I'd respond with encouragement and information about resources when appropriate. Maintaining a connection that had been forged in trauma, but that evolved into something like friendship, or at least mutual understanding between two people who'd shared an end experience that bonded them in ways difficult to explain to others. She started attending support groups for domestic violence survivors, found community with other women who understood her experience, who didn't question why she'd stayed as long as she did or why she hadn't seen the warning signs earlier, who simply supported her recovery without judgment or victim blaming. 3 months after the attack, Sarah started a blog about her experience, writing openly about her relationship with Derek, about the escalating abuse, about the decision to leave, about the aftermath and the attack, about the criminal justice process, about recovery and rebuilding. Her writing was raw, honest, unflinching in its examination of both the external violence she'd experienced and the internal struggle to heal from it. "I'm writing this," she explained to me when she started the blog, "because I want other women who are in abusive relationships to see that it's possible to leave, that it's possible to survive, that the system is flawed but sometimes it works, that there are people who will believe you and help you and fight for you. And I want abusers to see that they don't win, that even when they do enormous damage, they don't destroy us completely, that we survive and testify and tell our stories and make it harder for the next abuser to get away with it." The blog gained traction quickly, other survivors sharing it, domestic violence organizations linking to it, media outlets interviewing Sarah about her experience, and she became an advocate, a voice for victims. Someone who used her trauma as a platform to educate and push for systemic change. She testified before state legislature about gaps in restraining order enforcement, about the need for better resources for victims, about training for police and courts to recognize patterns of escalating violence before they become lethal, about the importance of believing victims when they report abuse rather than dismissing them as overdramatic or complicit in their own victimization. I watched her transform from someone hiding in a closet whispering for help to someone speaking publicly and powerfully about violence and survival, and I felt proud to have played a small role in making that transformation possible. Derek's trial was scheduled for 8 months after the attack, delayed by standard court backlogs and defense motions, but eventually the date arrived and Sarah was ready, had prepared extensively with prosecutors, had practiced her testimony, had steeled herself for seeing Derek again, for facing him across a courtroom, for recounting the worst night of her life to a room full of strangers. I attended the trial, sitting in the gallery, wanting to support Sarah, wanting to see justice served, wanting closure on the experience that had affected me deeply, even though I'd only been a voice on the phone. The courtroom was packed, domestic violence advocates present to support Sarah, media covering the case because Sarah's blog had made her story public, Derek's family there to support him despite his confession. Despite the overwhelming evidence, family loyalty sometimes persisting even in the face of undeniable wrongdoing. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating, presenting evidence in careful sequence, building from Derek and Sarah's relationship history through the escalating abuse, the restraining order, Derek's violation of that order through surveillance and stalking, the break-in, the attack, the confession, each piece of evidence supported by documents, testimony, physical evidence that left no room for doubt about what had happened or why. Sarah's testimony was powerful. She spoke clearly and calmly about the relationship, about recognizing the abuse, about leaving, about the attack, about hiding in the closet, about the fear and the pain and the certainty that she was going to die, and when she was asked about the 911 call, about those 4 minutes, she looked at me in the gallery and said, "The dispatcher saved my life. His voice kept me calm, kept me quiet, kept me connected to hope when I was absolutely terrified without him. I don't know if I would have survived." The 911 recording was played for the jury, the courtroom absolutely silent as they listened to Sarah's whispered pleas for help, to the sounds of Derek searching the house, to the moment of discovery, to the attack, to the sounds that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable, that made the reality of the violence undeniable, that eliminated any possibility of seeing this as a mutual altercation or a misunderstanding. When the recording ended, there was a heavy silence, the weight of what they'd heard settling over everyone present, and I saw several jurors looking at Derek with expressions of disgust, of anger, of judgment that would translate into a guilty verdict. The defense tried to mitigate, tried to present Derek as someone who'd lost control in a moment of emotional distress, tried to suggest that the relationship had been mutually toxic, but their arguments felt hollow against the evidence, against Sarah's testimony, against Derek's own words in his confession. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, coming back with guilty verdicts on all counts: attempted murder, home invasion, aggravated assault, stalking. Violating a restraining order, each verdict read aloud while Derek stared at the table, while Sarah cried with relief, while advocates applauded quietly. Sentencing came 2 weeks later, the judge delivering a lengthy statement about the seriousness of domestic violence, about the need for deterrence, about the particular danger posed by abusers who plan their violence, who stalk their victims, who demonstrate clear intent to kill. Before imposing a sentence of 28 years in prison, 28 years before Derek would be eligible for parole, ensuring he'd be in his late 50s before potentially being released, ensuring Sarah would have decades of safety, decades to rebuild her life without fear of him. After the sentencing, I felt something shift, a sense of completion that I hadn't realized I'd been waiting for. The case was truly closed now. Derek was in prison, Sarah was safe, justice had been served. and I could finally let go of the responsibility I'd been carrying since that night, the weight of wondering if I'd done enough, if I'd said the right things, if I'd kept Sarah calm enough or gotten help there fast enough. This sentence meant something concrete, meant 28 years where Derek couldn't hurt Sarah or anyone else, meant validation that what had happened was serious, was attempted murder, not just a domestic dispute, meant the system had worked this time, even if it didn't always work, even if too many cases ended differently, even if Sarah's survival was as much luck as anything else. The experience changed how I approached my work, made me more attuned to domestic violence calls, more aware of the patterns that indicate escalating danger, more aggressive about getting resources to victims quickly, more willing to push for faster response times when I sensed genuine life-threatening situations. I started training new dispatchers using Sarah's call as an example, playing the recording in classes, walking through the decisions I'd made, the information I'd gathered, the ways I'd kept her calm while coordinating response, turning that traumatic experience into teaching material that could help future dispatchers handle similar calls more effectively. Some trainees found the recording disturbing, found it hard to listen to the attack portion, but that was the point. They needed to understand what real terror sounded like, what real danger sounded like, so they'd recognize it when they encountered it in their own calls. Sarah continued her advocacy work, her blog growing into a full platform with resources for domestic violence victims, with directories of shelters and legal services, with advice on safety planning and leaving abusive relationships, with stories from other survivors who wanted to share their experiences. She partnered with organizations, spoke at conferences, trained police departments and court personnel on recognizing abuse patterns, became a recognized expert on domestic violence despite having no formal credentials beyond her lived experience, her credibility coming from her willingness to speak openly about what she'd endured and survived. "I never wanted to be a domestic violence advocate," she told me once. "I wanted to be an accountant, have a normal life, normal relationships, normal problems." But Derek took that possibility away when he decided I was his property. And so I'm making meaning from trauma, turning something that almost destroyed me into something that might help others. It's not what I chose, but it's what I'm doing. The statistics she uncovered through her advocacy work were sobering. Every 9 seconds, a woman is beaten in the United States. 1 in 4 women experiences severe intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Domestic violence is one of the leading causes of injury to women, more than car accidents, muggings, and rapes combined, and yet it receives less funding, less attention, less societal urgency than many issues that affect far fewer people. The criminal justice response was inadequate. Restraining orders were violated in over half of cases with little consequence until violence escalated. Many police departments were poorly trained in domestic violence response. Many prosecutors were reluctant to pursue cases that seemed like he said, she said disputes. Many judges were lenient with first-time domestic violence offenders even when patterns suggested escalation. The entire system was set up to fail victims until they were injured or killed. Sarah's advocacy focused on practical changes, pushing for better enforcement of restraining orders through electronic monitoring of offenders, pushing for mandatory arrest policies when orders were violated, pushing for specialized domestic violence courts with trained judges, pushing for victim advocates to be present during every stage of the legal process, pushing for funding for shelters and support services that were chronically underfunded, pushing for education in schools about healthy relationships and warning signs of abuse. She became frustrated by how slowly systems changed, by how much resistance there was to reforms even when evidence showed they worked, by how many people in positions of authority seemed to view domestic violence as a private matter rather than a public safety crisis, requiring urgent, coordinated response. I accompanied Sarah to some of her speaking engagements, providing the dispatcher's perspective on domestic violence calls, explaining what we heard, how we assessed danger, what challenges we faced in getting help to victims quickly enough, How we dealt with the emotional toll of listening to attacks we couldn't stop. Speaking publicly was outside my comfort zone. I was more comfortable behind a radio than in front of an audience. But I felt obligation to support Sarah's work, to add my voice to hers, to help people understand that domestic violence wasn't just a problem for victims and abusers. It was a problem for everyone who responded to those calls, everyone who tried to help, everyone who was affected by the violence that rippled outward from abusive relationships into families, communities, emergency services, courts, healthcare systems. One of the most powerful moments came when Sarah and I spoke at a conference for 911 dispatchers, several hundred people from across the region, and after our presentation, a young female dispatcher approached us, crying, and said, "I took a call like yours 6 months ago, woman hiding from her ex, and I did everything right. I got units there as fast as possible. I kept her calm, but he found her before police arrived and he killed her. And I've been carrying that guilt ever since, feeling like I failed, like I should have done something different." And hearing you talk about Sarah's call, hearing that sometimes we get there in time and sometimes we don't, that sometimes survivors live because of luck as much as our actions, that helped me understand that I didn't fail, that the system failed, that the abuser is responsible, not me. That interaction crystallized something for both Sarah and me. Our story wasn't just about what happened to her, wasn't just about one successful rescue. It was about the thousands of calls like hers, the hundreds where victims didn't survive, the countless dispatchers and officers and advocates who carried guilt and trauma from cases where they'd done everything right and it still wasn't enough, where the violence was too extreme, the abuser too determined, the response too slow despite everyone's best efforts. We needed to talk about those cases too, needed to acknowledge that the system was fundamentally inadequate, that individual heroics and dedication weren't enough when the underlying structure was flawed, when resources were insufficient, when societal attitudes still minimized the danger of domestic violence. Sarah started a support group for people who'd been affected by domestic violence indirectly, dispatchers who'd taken fatal calls, officers who'd arrived too late, family members who tried to help victims leave and had watched them return or be killed, advocates who worked with survivors who later were murdered by their abusers, creating space for people who carried secondary trauma from violence they'd witnessed or tried to prevent but couldn't. The group met monthly, facilitated by Dr. Chang, who donated her time, providing an environment where people could share experiences, process guilt, support each other through grief and frustration, acknowledge that they were affected by violence even if they weren't direct victims. I attended occasionally, finding value in hearing other stories, in understanding I wasn't alone in carrying these experiences, in building community with people who understood. The media attention from Sarah's advocacy in the trial brought other victims forward. Women who'd survived attacks by partners or ex-partners, women who'd been through the criminal justice system, women who wanted to share their stories as part of the growing movement to treat domestic violence as the public health crisis it was rather than as private family matter. Each story had unique details but common threads: escalating control, isolation from support systems, economic abuse that made leaving difficult, threats that were dismissed until they turned into actual violence, systems that failed to protect until it was too late or nearly too late, survival that depended on luck and coincidence as much as official intervention. The cumulative weight of these stories was overwhelming. Forced recognition that Sarah's case wasn't unusual, wasn't an outlier, was in fact representative of what thousands of women experienced every year, many of whom didn't survive to tell their stories. 2 years after Sarah's attack, the anniversary date, she organized a vigil for domestic violence victims who hadn't survived, held at the city courthouse, honoring the 17 women who'd been killed by intimate partners in our county over the previous 5 years. Each victim's name was read aloud, each story briefly told, each life acknowledged and mourned, and family members of several victims attended, holding photos of daughters and mothers and sisters who'd been taken by violence that could have been prevented with better systems, better intervention, better societal recognition of the danger. The vigil was somber, moving, angry in its grief, refusing to let these deaths be forgotten or dismissed as isolated incidents, insisting on seeing the pattern, seeing the systemic failure, seeing the urgency. I read 2 names at the vigil, women whose calls I'd taken, whose voices I'd heard in final moments before they were killed, whose cases haunted me in ways different from Sarah's because those calls had different endings, because help hadn't arrived in time, because I'd listened to them die despite doing everything I was trained to do. Speaking their names publicly, acknowledging their deaths, honoring their memories, provided closure I hadn't realized I needed, gave me space to grieve for people I'd never met, but whose deaths had affected me profoundly, allowed me to name the weight I'd been carrying and begin to set it down not because it didn't matter, but because holding it wasn't helping anyone, wasn't bringing them back, wasn't preventing future deaths. The vigil became an annual event, growing each year, attracting more people, drawing more media attention, becoming focal point for local domestic violence awareness and advocacy, Sarah's face and story becoming synonymous with the cause. Her survival making her a symbol even though she'd rather no one needed symbols because no one was being abused, because relationships were healthy and violence was rare, because the vigil didn't need to exist. But it did need to exist, would need to exist for years probably, because changing culture, changing systems, changing attitudes about domestic violence was generational work, was slow and frustrating and marked by small victories and persistent backlash from people who wanted to maintain status quo, who were comfortable with systems that protected abusers, who felt threatened by women's autonomy and equality. Derek came up for parole review after serving 12 years, possibility built into sentencing structure despite the 28-year sentence. And Sarah was notified, had right to submit victim impact statement, had right to appear at hearing, had right to argue against his release. She agonized over whether to engage with the parole process, whether to subject herself to seeing Derek again, to being in room with him, to potentially hearing him speak, to reliving trauma for parole board that might not even care about her perspective. She consulted with victim advocates, with therapists, with me, with other survivors who'd been through similar processes, trying to decide what was right for her healing versus what was right for ensuring Derek stayed incarcerated as long as possible. She decided to appear, decided her voice needed to be heard, decided that whatever personal cost it required was worth ensuring Derek didn't get released early, didn't get opportunity to hurt anyone else, didn't get to walk free while she still carried scars, physical and psychological, from his violence. I accompanied her to the hearing, sitting in the waiting area while she testified before the parole board, emerged 45 minutes later looking exhausted but resolute. He showed no remorse, she told me, talked about himself as the victim, as someone who'd been unfairly punished for a relationship dispute, minimized everything he did, blamed me for leaving him, for getting the restraining order for all of it, and the parole board saw through it. I could tell they saw through it. They denied his parole, said he needed to complete more rehabilitation programming, needed to demonstrate understanding of his actions and their impact, wouldn't be eligible for review again for another 5 years. The denial was victory, but also a reminder that Derek was still alive, still in the world even if behind bars, still thinking about Sarah presumably, still harboring resentment and blame, still dangerous even contained. Sarah would have to go through this process again in 5 years and potentially again after that, repeatedly having to prove to strangers that her abuser was still dangerous, repeatedly having to justify why he shouldn't be released, repeatedly having to relive trauma. The system requiring her ongoing participation in ways that felt like ongoing victimization, like the violence never really ended, it just transformed into bureaucratic process that demanded her attention and energy. I continued working as a dispatcher, now 8 years into the job, increasingly focused on training and quality assurance, helping newer dispatchers develop skills, reviewing difficult calls, providing support when they had traumatic experiences similar to what I'd experienced with Sarah's call. The work felt more meaningful now, felt like I was contributing to building capacity within the system, helping create a culture where emotional support was normalized, where seeking help after difficult calls was expected, not stigmatized, where we acknowledged that this work took a toll and provided resources to help people manage that toll sustainably. Not all departments were like ours. Many still operated under old-school mentality where showing emotion was weakness, where you were expected to handle anything without support, where burnout was accepted as just the cost of the job. But slowly things were changing. Slowly the culture was recognizing that taking care of first responders was essential to taking care of the public they served. Sarah and I were invited to speak at a national conference on domestic violence, presenting our story to an audience of advocates, law enforcement, legal professionals, researchers, sharing lessons learned, highlighting what had worked and what could be improved, answering questions about the coordination between dispatch and response, about victim psychology during crisis, about survivor recovery and advocacy. The presentation was well received, led to invitations to speak at other conferences, to contribute to training materials, to consult on policy recommendations, expanding our impact beyond our local community, helping shape national conversation about domestic violence response. Neither of us had imagined that a 911 call would lead to this, to public advocacy and national platform, but trauma has a way of redirecting lives, of creating purposes that didn't exist before, of transforming victims into advocates and witnesses into activists. The work was healing in its own way, taking something terrible and making it meaningful, using our experience to potentially prevent others from experiencing similar violence, to improve systems that had failed too many people, to give voice to issue that was too often minimized or ignored. But it was also exhausting, constantly engaging with trauma, with violence, with stories of suffering, even in service of prevention and education. Took emotional toll, required ongoing therapy and support, required boundaries about how much we could do without burning out. Sarah and I both had to learn to say no to requests, to protect our capacity, to remember that we couldn't help everyone, couldn't attend every event, couldn't respond to every survivor who reached out wanting to share their story, that we were just two people trying to make a difference within limits of our energy and mental health. 5 years after the original call, on the anniversary date, Sarah organized a different kind of event, not a vigil but a celebration of survival, bringing together survivors from our support groups, from advocacy networks, from the community of people who'd endured domestic violence and lived to tell their stories, creating space for joy and resilience rather than just grief and anger. The event included music, food, art created by survivors, spoken word performances, resource tables with information about services, testimonials from people at various stages of recovery, demonstrating that survival wasn't just about not dying. It was about reclaiming life, about finding happiness and purpose and connection despite trauma, about refusing to let violence define you completely, even as you acknowledged it changed you. I attended with my wife, who I'd married the previous year. Someone I'd met through mutual friends who knew nothing about my work when we started dating, who'd learned gradually about the calls I took, the trauma I carried, the advocacy work I'd become involved in, and who'd chosen to be with me anyway, chosen to support me through difficult moments, chosen to build life with someone whose work and history included darkness she'd never experienced. She understood that Sarah's call and the aftermath had changed me fundamentally, had made me more serious, more focused on meaningful work, more aware of violence and vulnerability, less willing to ignore injustice or accept inadequate systems, and she'd fallen in love with the person those experiences had created, even while wishing I'd never had to go through them. At the celebration, Sarah pulled me aside, said she had something to show me, led me to a quiet corner and pulled out her phone. showed me a photo of a newborn baby, tiny and perfect, swaddled in hospital blankets. "I had a daughter," she said, voice full of wonder. "3 weeks ago, her name is Hope, and I'm terrified every day that I won't be able to protect her, that I'll mess her up with my trauma, that she inherit my fear, but I'm also determined to raise her to be strong, to recognize red flags, to never accept abuse, to know she's worthy of love that doesn't hurt, and I wanted you to see her. Wanted you to know that Derek didn't win, that life continues, that good things can still happen even after terrible things, that his violence didn't end my story, it just created a difficult chapter that I survived." The photo made me emotional in ways I hadn't expected. This tiny life that existed because Sarah had survived, because help had arrived in time, because 4 minutes and 32 seconds of whispered communication had prevented murder and allowed future to unfold, allowed Sarah to heal enough to trust again, to love again, to bring new life into the world. And I felt the weight of responsibility, the awareness that Hope's existence depended in some small way on decisions I'd made that night, on my ability to keep Sarah calm, on the units arriving when they did, on all the factors that combined to create survival instead of death. It was humbling and terrifying and beautiful all at once, the recognition that our actions ripple forward in ways we can't always see, that keeping someone alive means keeping all their future moments alive, all the experiences they'll have, all the people they'll impact, all the love they'll give and receive. I'm dedicating my life to making sure other women have the chance to have moments like this, Sarah continued, to survive their trauma and build futures, to have children if they want them, to have careers, to have joy, to have normal problems instead of fearing for their lives. That's what all the advocacy is for. All the policy work, all the training, all the speaking. It's for Hope and for all the future daughters and sons who deserve to grow up in a world where domestic violence is rare and swiftly addressed rather than common and inadequately responded to. Her commitment was absolute, was fueled by motherhood now in addition to her own survival, and I knew she would never stop fighting, would never accept status quo, would push until systems changed or until she'd exhausted every possibility for change. The celebration continued late into the evening, survivors dancing and laughing and sharing contact information, building networks of support that would sustain them through difficult times, through triggers and anniversaries and moments when trauma resurfaced. And I watched thinking about how different this was from the vigil, how both were necessary, how grief and joy coexist in survivors' lives, how healing isn't linear but rather a constant negotiation between pain and growth, between memory and present, between what was lost and what remains. Sarah had created community, had brought people together who understood each other in ways outsiders couldn't, had built something positive from something terrible, had refused to let violence have the final word. I still listen to the recording of Sarah's call occasionally, not for training purposes anymore, but as reminder, as anchor to why the work matters, as connection to the person I was that night and the person I've become since, as evidence that what we do makes difference even when it doesn't feel like it, even when systems are inadequate, even when too many cases end badly. The recording has been used in training programs nationwide now, has been heard by thousands of dispatchers, has improved response to domestic violence calls in measurable ways, has saved lives indirectly by teaching dispatchers how to handle similar situations. And I'm proud of that legacy, proud that something so painful has generated something so useful. But I also acknowledge the cost, acknowledge that taking that call changed me permanently, gave me nightmares and anxiety and hypervigilance that required years of therapy to manage, made me more aware of danger everywhere, made me protective of loved ones in ways that sometimes bordered on obsessive, made me unable to hear certain sounds or tones without being transported back to that night, to those 4 minutes and 32 seconds of holding my breath while Sarah hid and Derek searched, and help raced to arrive. The trauma is permanent, is managed rather than cured, is something I'll carry the rest of my life, and that's okay. That's the price of bearing witness, of being present for someone's worst moment, of helping them survive when survival felt impossible. I think about the alternate timeline. The version where Derek found Sarah 30 seconds earlier, where units arrived 30 seconds later, where that tiny margin of time shifted and Sarah died, where I listened to her being killed, where the call ended not with relief but with horror, with silence, with failure. And I'm grateful beyond measure that we live in the timeline where she survived, where she recovered, where she built a life and had a daughter and became an advocate, where the story has ongoing chapters instead of ending that night in a closet with violence and death. That gratitude coexists with anger at the systems that failed Sarah initially, at the restraining order that didn't protect her, at the society that enables domestic violence through inadequate response and victim-blaming culture, at the reality that Sarah's survival was as much luck as intervention. The detail that never made it into any official report, the thing that haunts me most, isn't any specific moment from the call, isn't the sounds of violence or Sarah's terror or the desperate race against time. It's the understanding that came afterward, the knowledge that we got lucky that night, that so many factors had to align for Sarah to survive, that in slightly different circumstances she would have died despite everyone doing their jobs correctly, despite her doing everything right, despite the system working as designed, because the system was fundamentally inadequate to the threat and remains inadequate, and will continue being inadequate until we decide as a society that domestic violence deserves the resources and urgency we give to other public safety threats, until we stop treating it as private matter or relationship problem and start treating it as the public health crisis it is, until we build systems that protect victims before they're attacked rather than just investigating after they're injured or killed, and until that happens, dispatchers will keep taking calls from women whispering that someone is in their house. Officers will keep racing to arrive in time, and sometimes we'll get there and sometimes we won't. And the difference will be measured in seconds and luck, and that's not good enough. That's never been good enough. That will never be good enough. And living with that knowledge, carrying that awareness, understanding that inadequacy and feeling powerless to change it fast enough, that's the real trauma. That's what stays with me years later. That's what Sarah's whisper taught me, that sometimes doing everything right isn't enough, and somehow we have to accept that and keep trying anyway.